Welcome to Slate School and our conversation with Justin Reich on why technology alone can't transform education. Slate School is committed to excellence in education, and we are delighted to present the Education Idea Lab, which is a unique virtual series that is free and open to the public. This thought-leading event convenes leaders and change makers and participants from all sectors of education and innovation. So thank you for joining us. We are thrilled to have all of you with us here today. My name is Julie Mountcastle, and I'm head of school at Slate School. And I'll briefly introduce you to Slate School for those of you who don't know anything about us, and then we'll hear from our amazing guest. That's my buddy, Berkeley. She likes to be with us for the Idea Lab. Slate School is an independent 501c3 nonprofit K-12 school where education is focused on cultivating creativity, fostering ingenuity, and inspiring a deep passion for lifelong learning. We believe that an extraordinary education should be available to all children, regardless of their family's ability to pay. So at Slate School, admissions are 100% need blind, and we then go on to meet all demonstrated need for every admitted student. At Slate, we formed a community of educators that is constantly striving to improve practice and to create meaningful educational experiences for learners of all ages and to change the landscape of education. Slate School convenes experts for important, authentic conversations about education. And these online dialogues, just like today's, are free and open to the public. And we're so happy to have all of you with us today. And now our guest, Justin Reich. Justin is an assistant professor of digital media in the Comparative Media Studies writing department at MIT and the director of the Teaching Systems Lab. He is the author of Failure to Disrupt, Why Technology Alone Can't Transform Education, and the host of TeachLab Podcast. He earned his doctorate from Harvard Graduate School of Education and was the Richard L. Menschel HarvardX Research Fellow. He is a past fellow at the Berkman-Klein Center for Internet and Society. His writings have been published in Science, Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, the Washington Post, the Atlantic, and other scholarly journals and public venues. He started his career as a high school history teacher and coach of wrestling and outdoor adventure activities. And we are so incredibly lucky to have you here tonight. So welcome, Justin.
Thanks so much for having me.
I'm so happy you're here. I love your book.
Thanks, Julie.
Really?
It's from the library. It's got a barcode on it.
I'm sorry, say again?
It had a barcode on it. It's from the library?
It's from our classroom library.
That's great.
At our school, we've been, well, when we find a book from, an author, a picture book, we barcode it and keep it for our kids. And when we find a great book that's like candy for teachers, we barcode it and keep it in the library. So I'm eventually going to have to take the Post-its out so other people can make their own Post-its.
Excellent.
So Justin, just get us started here. Just, could you just share a bit about your journey to education? How did you end up in education?
I was a camp counselor when I was a kid, and I taught lifeguarding in college and other kinds of first aid sort of stuff. And when I was in high school, I think I knew that I wanted to be a teacher of some kind, and so I just sort of did. I studied history in college, and after doing some different kind of weird stuff right after I graduated, I eventually found myself teaching in a history classroom.
Wow. So you just kind of jumped into it.
Yep. Yeah. It was sort of the plan from the beginning.
Awesome. Well, that's great. I think a lot of educators are like that, and we're lucky. We're very lucky that people choose this profession because it's not an easy one.
I think so. I think there are folks who choose it because they had really good experiences in school and really enjoyed it and found it to be a nurturing place. I think there are a lot of people who choose it because they had really lousy experiences in school and they didn't want people to have those same experiences and they wanted to make it better. I was definitely one of the people in the former. Like, schools were basically great for me, and I was excited to stay there.
That's great. That's great. So from history teacher to where you are now, what brought you out of the classroom? What convinced you that doing what you're doing now is more in line with your passion?
Well, I'm out of the high school classroom, but I still teach at MIT. So I had 25 students this morning that we were doing media studies kinds of things with. But when I started teaching, the department head who interviewed me said, "Can you teach world history?" And I said, "Well, I've never done it before, but I'm sure I'll figure it out. I just really need this job." And then he said, "We have a cart of laptops in the back corner of the classroom." This was in 2003. There are these blue and orange clamshell MacBooks. And he said, "And we want you to use them every day. We have this sort of pilot program in our 9th grade world history class where we have some computers there, and we just want the teachers to use them and figure out, what one-to-one computing might look like in our school." I said, "You put a cart of bananas in the back corner of the classroom and I'll teach with them. I really need this job. So if you can hire me." So they hired me, and I just got really excited by the way that, emerging technologies let me transfer responsibility from learning off my shoulders onto the shoulders of my students, that led them, connect to resources outside the school, let them collaborate with each other, between classes, with people outside of our school, all that kind of good stuff. And so I did that for a few years, and then just like a bunch of life stuff sort of intervened. My wife was finishing her doctorate, my mom was sick, some other stuff. So I ended up I ended up leaving that school and not really having a very good plan for what to do. But a colleague of mine who I was teaching with was a really entrepreneurial guy. His name was Tom DeCord. And he got a sort of a grant one summer to try to learn more about teaching history with technology. And as soon as he figured some things out, he was like, "Oh, I'm going to run a workshop. I'll teach everything I've learned to other people." And so he and I ended up starting a consulting business that was called, that eventually was called EdTech Teacher. And we worked with schools and districts to help integrate technology in thoughtful, student-centered kinds of ways. And in the beginning, we were trying to figure out how it would make any money. And we were like, well, maybe we should apply for grants. And so we started looking at the grants, and they all required someone with a PhD. And I was like, well, I'm not really doing anything. I'll go get a PhD. And so I applied to a couple of programs, and that's how I ended up in graduate school.
Wow. For those of you, obviously you didn't hear us, we were talking before about how planning things doesn't always lead to the same outcome as you might imagine, and how often life takes us in unplanned ways. And that's a pretty good example. That's a pretty good example.
Yep.
So, I'm thinking about your book, and you wrote your prologue in March of 2020, and wow, so much has changed since then. And I'm wondering, what's your perspective today about how tech helped us, and maybe where it let us down?
Yeah. So it was, the first schools in Seattle had just started closing around the time that I had the final copy of the book in my hands, the final opportunity to make any kind of changes. And I remember talking with my editors and some other folks who would sort of help me in the writing process, saying, "Oh man, is there anything in here that's going to be really embarrassing 6 months from now when the world changes an awful lot?" And we ended up not changing anything. And I think there are two constants in the history of education technology that have appeared over and over again. And if you find yourself in circumstances where you need to bet on the future, these are two pretty good guidelines to work with. The first is that when teachers get access to new technologies, they use those new technologies to extend existing practices. They use new technologies to do the same kinds of things they were doing before. We've known this pretty well since the 1980s. There was a researcher named Judith Sandholz who ran a project called the Apple Classrooms of Tomorrow, where they brought these super sophisticated Macintosh computing. I mean, actually, I think at that time they weren't even Macintosh, like these Apple IIe, Apple II Plus kind of computers, and they had the first networked classrooms. And what they found was that when teachers first got these tools, they just did the same kinds of things that they were doing before. And it was only after a pretty long process of coaching, of professional learning, of practice, of experimentation, of support, that some fraction of teachers ended up doing things that were really kind of different than what you were able to do before you had the Apple Classrooms of Tomorrow. So that's one sort of guidepost. The second guidepost is that learners from affluent families with more financial, social, and technical capital are better able to take advantage of new innovations, even when they're free, even when we think they're targeted at folks from less affluent homes. It's very difficult to build new technology systems that reduce inequality. It is much easier to build new technology systems that do nothing or expand or exacerbate inequalities. So if you looked at what are the sort of core ways to describe what happened over the last year and a half? Overwhelmingly, when schools around the world pivoted to some form of emergency pandemic, remote hybrid learning, they used two technologies. And they are two of the very oldest technologies that we have. The first are learning management systems. People pick something like Google Classroom or Schoology or Canvas. And learning management systems were theorized in the 1960s and 70s. They were commercialized in the 1990s. They were made open source in the 2000s. These are some of the oldest tools that we have. What they primarily do is they allow teachers and students to pass documents back and forth. So my daughter, who's going back in person to school now, she has a folder in her backpack. It says to home on one side, it says to school on the other side. And that's what a learning management system is. Right. And then the second technology that we used when it was introduced in the 1930s was called video telephony and is now called video conferencing. But again, we have almost a sort of century of experience with, if you describe it, it sounds like it's something that would be useful for teaching, like a speaker can talk. And the other people can see the speaker, and they can also sort of see a subset of the other folks in the virtual space. And anyone who's taught on Zoom knows that teaching through Zoom is like teaching through a keyhole. You can kind of see and hear what's happening on the other side with some awkward straining, but it's not really conducive. So what we did with those two tools is we replicated at great effort, at great expense, as closely as possible, the existing in-person schooling system, even particularly for elementary school students, when it made no developmental sense whatsoever. When it was basically impossible to do, that's still the model that we adopted, because when you give schools and school systems new technologies, they use it to extend existing practices. That's like the thing that you should guess. And then how well did that work in different places? Well, in communities where folks were affluent and well networked and had replacement devices and could afford childcare support and other kinds of things, it went okay. In lots of other parts of the world where there aren't all those resources, it was much more of a disaster. And so once again, we saw, the sort of yawning inequalities that are in our society, it sort of both revealed anew and exacerbated. So that's a very long-winded way of saying, what was I thinking in March of 2020? I was thinking like, I bet, I don't know exactly what's going to happen, but it's probably, but these two guideposts are useful at almost any time in the history of schooling and education technology. And I think they proved good guides for the last 2 years as well.
Yeah, you're right. And it's funny, at Slate School, the way we do education here is a little bit different, but we definitely use technology to do what we do. We didn't use technology in the pandemic to do something different, we found it weird because we're not a real tech school. We don't use a lot of technology here, but we were depending on technology for community, to be with each other. And it was very different and a poor substitute. So I'm glad it's passed, but I hope that we've learned something from this. Yeah, what is it that we take away from it?
Yeah, there are a bunch of important things that we learned, whether or not we'll implement based on those learnings. There are lots of teachers who found new ways of integrating technology into their routines. Most of those ways are sort of modest, but they're going to find them. My joke in higher education is that like professors will teach the way that they've taught in the past, but like their Canvas sites are going to be a lot better. And that's okay. Like that's taking some things and moving them forward. I have a colleague who teaches art class, electronic arts classes at Northern Vermont University. And in the pandemic, she had all of her students log into Zoom, those who were in person and those who were remote. And one of the things she found is that like troubleshooting problems in person was actually easier because you could just like really quickly put someone's screen up on your screen. And, before you had to kind of walk to where they were and explain it to other people, and it didn't work that well. And she's like, I'm just going to keep doing this. This is just better. So, there'll be little tweaks like that. The other things that I hope we would learn I think are more speculative, and we may not learn very much from them. But I'll, in the spirit of remaining hopeful, we have a disastrously weak social safety net for children and their families in the United States. And that social safety net largely consists of uncompensated labor from women and the work of schools. And that's not a way for society to raise its children. It should not be the responsibility of schools to make sure that students are fed and housed and have mental health screening and technology access and all those kinds of things. There should be other institutions in society that take care of that so that schools can work on teaching and learning. And the more robust our social safety net is during normal times, the better it will take care of children and families in all the kinds of climate emergencies and all the sorts of things to come. We learned that many of the things that we thought were fixed and immovable and permanent in schools are actually flexible and contingent and plastic and malleable. There are all kinds of things over the last year and a half that you would have been like, you could never do that actually you can do. You can send all the kids home. You can have them learn outside. You can take breaks at different times. You can change your schedules. You can do all these sort of things that you would have, you can waive all the graduation requirements. There's things that we can do. There was a group of high school teachers in Madison, Wisconsin we interviewed recently, and they said, we know how to change. We changed every 3 weeks the last year, and we're exhausted from it, but we know that in the future we can change. And so, if I'm optimistic about the future, I'm hopeful that schools will sort of look at all those things that we knew in the moment we could change, and figure out how we apply that same kind of energy and flexibility and creativity to normal times as we found during an emergency. And then maybe the last, important thing that we discovered is that students are able to learn when they are under far fewer restrictions. So when we bring kids to school, we police their behavior in all kinds of ways. We say you can only pee at certain times, you can only sit in certain kinds of furniture, you definitely can't wear sweatshirts, you definitely can't wear sweatshirts, that cover your, that hood that cover the top of your head. Like, how could you possibly learn with something like that on? And we sent kids home for a year, and they sat on their beds and they ate whenever they want to, and they took little naps during the school day, and they went to the bathroom whenever they felt like it, and they learned just fine. I mean, they had challenges, but the challenges were not from the lack of policing their behavior. In fact, I think a lot of the tensions that lots of schools around the country are experiencing this year are sort of coming back from a year when lots of students were home and not experiencing this kind of policing and control, and coming back into buildings where they're experiencing a lot of policing and control, and sort of working through those kinds of tensions. So, that's another, I don't know how much educational systems will learn from that experience, but that's another area in which I hope that we would be reflective about.
Well, I think there's going to have to be a fair dose of humility in that moment, because I think if we're really looking, we could find a lot of reasons to say there really wasn't, this big deficit. Actually, kids were learning constantly, because we're all always learning if we're awake. And it doesn't matter where we are. School is everywhere. We say at Slate School, we say school is everywhere. It doesn't matter if you're on a bus, you're at school. If you're in a museum, you're at school. If you're in your room watching a movie, you're at school. You're learning. You're always learning. But it requires us to say that perhaps the solutions to our problems are not as snazzy as we think they are, as we think they need to. Because then if the solutions aren't snazzy, then maybe the solutions were right there in front of us all along. And so then we have to inwardly say, well, what have we been doing for the last 50 years? And why have we been, going down this rabbit hole? But I don't know, often these snazzy technologies, those are the things that generate excitement and funding. When we say it's new, then people are all like, oh, this is it. Let's throw out everything we've ever done before. And let's move toward this, regardless of whether we know that it's a positive impact. So how do we shift that narrative?
Yeah, I'm certainly hopeful that some of that will be chastened in the years ahead. For the last 2 decades, education technology enthusiasts have claimed that we're on the cusp a dramatic transformation in schooling. That in particular, we were going to have, we're going to have a series of new technology-mediated tools that are going to lead to educational systems and transformations that are better than the existing school systems. Well, the existing school system for the last 2 years has been really hobbled, really damaged. And for most people, remote learning was somewhere between disappointing and disastrous. It was a really lousy experience. And so, it turned out that like new technology mediated learning systems aren't even better than like hobbled, crummy school systems. Like we're excited to go back to schools and being in person with one another. There is something sort of in schools that is uniquely catalytic about new technologies. And that's probably one of the main reasons why I've remained interested in technology in schools. If you go to a group of faculty members and say, like the world is changing, the kinds of things that people need to thrive in the future is changing. So we should probably rethink our pedagogy, our relationship with students, our curriculum. Lots of schools are like, we're doing pretty well, that's fine. No, thank you. If you go into the same group of faculty and you say, hey, we've got these like shiny new devices and we're going to give them all to you, and they're sort of a symbol of how things will be different in the future, about how we might need to rethink our pedagogy, our relationship with students, our curriculum. The exact same group of faculty will actually be much more receptive in that moment. And maybe that's a good thing, and maybe it's not. But it's certainly one of the things that I think that technology has the potential to be a catalyst of conversations about school change and school improvement, because it gives people an opportunity to say we should change, not because we were failing before or wrong in the past, but we have new capacities for the future.
Right.
That's one sort of optimistic way of thinking about the kinds of receptivity that schools have around those moments. The trick is, oftentimes those conversations are framed entirely around the capacities of the new technology, but that's not really where the change is. The change is when we change our systems, our routines, our structures, all that other kind of stuff. And it's actually quite challenging around technology adoptions. I think a lot of schools face this challenge. When you're trying to make technology work, I always think of this old Far Side cartoon where a Neanderthal is accidentally in a classroom and he raised his hand and said, "I'm sorry, Mr. Smith, can I go home? My brain is full." Something about dealing with technology that just like you get stuck on the wires and the chargers and the password logins and all this other kind of stuff. And it's really easy for communities to lose track of this core idea that if technology is useful, it's got to be in the service of learning. That if we don't have a meaningful vision of how teaching and learning will change because we have these new tools, then we're not actually going to see learning changes and learning improvements. We'll just see us like using more expensive technology to do the same kinds of things.
And yet it continues to be everywhere. And there are people who are, holding up the latest new thing and saying, this is what they're doing over here. And it's really successful. So we should all be doing that.
We should pursue successful new practices. And some of the, the whole message of the book really is like, okay, so the ed tech evangelists, they're wrong and they're crazy. Don't listen to them. Like schools, there's not going to be sweeping changes in schools. The pandemic was the most powerful demonstration of educational conservatism that any of us will ever see in our lifetimes again. But that also doesn't mean that technology is a total waste of time. There are things that technology lets us do that are better, but it tends not to be sweepingly better. It tends to be better, for particular students in particular kinds of domains, in particular contexts. So there's ways that technology can help. But it's not a kind of universal shift. I mean, the other thing which is hard about schools is at any given moment, schools can get better in 100 different ways. There are all kinds of different pathways towards making a school better. Technology will help with some of them and not that much with others. One of the things that schools around the country are really struggling with right now is community building and relationships. There's much more sort of violence and fighting and conflict in schools this year than there has been sort of in pre-pandemic years, which is a real problem. there's, mostly technology won't fix that. But it will maybe a little bit. One of the things that teachers discovered over the past year is that there's a lot of neat ways to use video conferencing to connect home and schools. There are a lot of schools that came out of the last 2 years being like, the only in-person parent-teacher conference has got to be a thing in the past. Like there are way too many parents that are excluded when we don't give people virtual opportunities to connect. And that kind of community building is important. There's other ways that we do online community building, but also, but if our problem is that we have too many kids with too much pent up stress that are getting into too many fights in school, like it's not a technology, you're not going to buy smart boards and fix that.
Right.
It's a problem.
Right, but I think you hit on something important, because you do increase the potential for communication in that moment. Right.
Yeah.
So like it was an honor actually in a lot of, in a lot of instances to be invited into the living room of all of my students. Right. I'm seeing them in their pajamas. Their, mom and dad are walking by with a cup of coffee. Somebody else is on a Zoom in the other room. It was, I mean, I wouldn't choose to have it again, but I would say that the takeaway from it is that, I feel I had a home visit with every student every day.
There's a lot of schools that are taking away from that. Like, oh, this home visit thing, we got to do more of that. Like if we can't Zoom into their homes anymore, let's like restructure our school system so that we can drive there more often, so that we can meet in people's neighborhoods and playgrounds and those kinds of things. Yeah, I mean, teachers are completely like flat out wiped, exhausted right now. It's been a really, really hard couple of years. But I do feel like in lots of communities, there's sort of all these ideas bubbling behind people's heads. Like once I can get past the sort of ongoing exhaustion of the pandemic, there are some new things that folks are doing. It also brings the kinds of things you described, bring new sensibilities. There are lots of folks. There are good reasons to think of school as the place where we bring everyone and they can have kind of the same experience. There's, one of the nice things that schools does is sort of level people. You can come from different kinds of homes, different kinds of backgrounds. You can come here and you can have a shared experience that starts from the same place.
It actually makes it better if you come from those different places, right?
It makes it better if you come from those different places. I think for a lot of teachers, they were like, oh, my students come from really different places. I need to stop assuming so much that they're coming to school and that we're having a sort of level set experience. Because now that I'm looking in their homes, I'm realizing, I've talked with one teacher in the Boston Public Schools who himself is from a working class background from South Central Los Angeles. He teaches advanced classes. He was like, the thing I realized this year is that my kids got a lot of stuff going on at home, and I really need to accommodate that in my teaching plans. But I think a lot of teachers discovered a lot more grace and flexibility this year, and their students noticed for sure. We did this research project where we've now had about 250 teachers interview about 5,000 students and send us the results from their queries. We had them basically ask 5 questions, like what went really well last year? What was really hard about last year? What do you feel like you lost? What are you most proud of? And what do you hope adults do differently next year, this year now? Or what do you hope they don't do differently? And certainly really high on young people's lists was, preserving that sort of grace and flexibility that they discovered in the pandemic.
It's so funny that you said there are 5 questions, and the ones you mentioned, I teach in a project-based school. Our school is, and there are many challenges to assessment in that. Well, actually, there aren't challenges to assessment. There are challenges to expressing what you're assessing, right? To share it with others. That's the challenge, to share it with other people in ways that they can understand. And one of the things that we do is at the beginning of every school year, at the beginning of the first project cycle, we ask 5 questions, almost identical really to the ones that you're asking there, but it's about, at the conclusion of their project, it's about their project. And then we ask the same set of questions at the conclusion of their 5th project cycle. And then over the, at the end of the year, we look at how their responses have changed. They're not domain specific. They're about what kind of learner they've become over the course of the year. And it would be really great to ask those 5 questions that you just asked every year of our students to see, how we're doing. Because I think it would be really powerful over time to see if we're actually improving the things that we care about improving.
Yeah, I think that kind of data collection is sort of enormously important, and schools get so understandably get so caught up in the kind of assessment and data that they're required to collect around schools. That they miss a lot of that. I mean, a number of years ago, I sort of worked out this set of ideas called the cycle of experiment and experience. And it sort of talked about how schools improved. And one of the things that was sort of strikingly missing from that formulation was any kind of assessment. The cycle of experiment and experience is like, how is it that schools get better? The most common phenomenon is that a few teachers get excited about a thing and they try it and it gets a little better. And then they show some other folks in the building how to do it. And then a few more people try it. And if you're lucky, over time, that sort of cycle of experiment and experience proceeds. Actually, even when schools think they're doing top-down sort of curriculum or pedagogy reform, it actually looks like that, because you'll say like, okay, you're all going to adopt this new math curriculum. And most people don't, or they do it in the most, sort of like minimally obligatory sort of way. And it's really only a handful of people that are like, oh yeah, we'll actually try this thing. And it's only, if you interview teachers about who has the most influence over their pedagogy, it's other teachers. But the thing that I observed when I sort of came up with this model and many years later realized like there's no assessment or evaluation in that model. There's no moment where people are being like, is this thing actually working in the way that we want it to? And it wasn't in that model because it wasn't happening in the schools that I were observing. People build new things and try new things, but we're often insufficiently reflective about like, okay, if we said that we did this thing because we wanted students to be better at reasoning from evidence, have we looked at their writing over the last 5 years and see whether or not they're actually better at reasoning from evidence or not?
Yeah. And, what's frustrating, I think, too, is that, then if that product that's generated by the teachers or even top down and then horizontally from teacher to teacher, if that works, then there's some inclination to have every school system in the nation adopt it in exactly the same way that it was implemented so specifically in the originating.
That's like economists' fault. There are people who are sort of responsible for that. There are other domains in human experience where like that works reasonably well. The way medicine works is that you do small scale trials in particular places with particular communities, and because human bodies are relatively similar to one another across contexts, if you find a vaccine which prevents infection in a few hundred or a few thousand people, but it probably work other places. You need to go ask your sister, buddy. You need to go ask your sister, kiddo. And then,
so it works for medicine. It works for medicine, but it doesn't work so well for schools, right?
Yeah, a message that I've tried to convey around some of these things is that it's not so important to get the one right system as it is to get one system right. There's a lot of good ways to become a good school. And the thing, what a lot of the very best schools have in common is that they have a coherent vision about what high quality instruction looks like, that you can talk to all the people in the community and they have some shared understanding of what that vision for high quality instruction looks like. And then they go and take they're part of a sort of continuous improvement process. But the crazy thing is that some of those different educational systems look quite different from one another. You can visit sort of project-based learning schools and IB schools and no excuses charter schools, and they can have pedagogical philosophies that seem quite different from one another, and they can all be great schools. And the thing they have in common is that they're good at getting everybody on the same page and sort of pulling oars in the same direction.
Yeah. And maybe specifically serving the community that they serve. Maybe they know the kids in that area. Maybe they understand. Hopefully, that's what they understand.
I think that's exactly right. I was saying before we started broadcasting that my kids went to school in rural Vermont last year. And the curriculum in a lot of places in rural Vermont increasingly has an emphasis on sort of place-based learning and connections to the land. So my 4th grade daughter made maple syrup last year with, from the trees that were on campus and the sugar shack that was next door and things like that. And Vermont has to do that because its youth population is evaporating, and it needs to convince people to remain in the state. And part of the way that people remain connected to the state is they feel a real attachment to the land and the place that they're in. There are other parts in the world that sort of don't have that, for whom a place-based curriculum just wouldn't be as relevant as other kinds of things. So this thing, which is like, I mean, in some ways sort of existential for rural Vermont schools. If they can't get this right, they won't continue to exist in the form that they're in right now, would be, as you're saying, sort of inappropriate or just not, not that relevant in other kinds of places. I mean, I think also, all schools can conceivably benefit from some attention to place and so forth, but it's different in different contexts.
Absolutely. So just kind of veering a little bit back toward the tech piece, I'm wondering, how do we make something that is that's simple enough for everybody to use, that is still interesting enough to everyone that they want to use it?
Yes, you've just described what my colleague David Wiley calls the Wiley reusability paradox, which is, he draws it as kind of a parabola. My little Zoom meeting thing won't show you my finger very well, but things that are really useful and really great for learning tend to be pretty specific to particular places and particular programs. Things which are really widely useful in lots of different places, they are like widely accessible, tend to not be that great. And a lot of times, if you try to build things that are both that sort of make compromises, you find like dramatic loss in quality on both of those dimensions. So it's a really common problem and common challenge. There are some domains. I think another thing is they're like, every grade level is different. Every subject discipline is different. Math has some components which translate well across lots of different contexts. There are all kinds of great math teachers who will tell you about how they make math work and feel relevant and connected to their particular communities. But there's a lot that's just sort of baked into the puzzles and structure of math, which is pretty universal. And so we're actually pretty good at building technologies that can be used in lots of places that lots of folks benefit from. One of the things that we've worked on, in some respects, an important thing to understand about education technology is that it's a 60 or 70 year venture. As soon as we had computers that were the size of your living room, computer scientists and learning scientists have partnered to develop new technologies to help people learn. So we've been doing this for a very, very long time. And one of the things that we've been working on are sort of these like cognitive tutors, kind of tools where the computer teaches you a little bit about math and then gives you some problems. And if you do well, it gives you harder problems. And if you do not so well, you get easier problems or more help. And we've now, for elementary school students, built sort of gamified versions of these things like Dreambox and ST Math and stuff like that. And they're okay. They're pretty good for some kids. They're probably more okay on average. Like those work pretty universally for lots of different kinds. They were particularly useful during the pandemic because I think while they're not better than most in-person instruction, they were sort of better than a lot of like pandemic remote Zoom weird instruction.
So I don't want to get too in the weeds in it, but I think it's an important piece. You talk about the instructionist and the constructivist philosophies as related to technology, and I think I think that's a big inflection point. So I'm just wondering, maybe you could talk a little bit about the advantages of each and how they relate to what we're talking about today.
Yeah, sure. So when I teach my classes on education at MIT, they all start with a little bit of learning science. And I think there are basically, almost from time immemorial, two ideas about how people learn. So Plutarch famously said something along the lines of, education is not the filling of a pail, but the kindling of a flame. And there are a bunch of people throughout history who've been like, no, it's actually kind of a lot like filling a pail. And filling pails is really good, and here's why. So there are these sort of, generally speaking, two ideas. In 20th century America, the two sort of champion educational philosophers of this were two guys named Edward Thorndike and John Dewey. So John Dewey is much better known. He, sort of an educator's educator, a person who believed that, education was not preparation for life, it's life itself. The best educational experiences were structured like apprenticeships. You sort of immerse students in these experiences and they become connected to their community and they sort of do these things. And then Edward Thorndike was this guy who was like, a lot of what education is is sort of pouring new ideas into other people's heads. And in fact, you can sort of measure a bunch of that pouring. Like you can measure the rate at which you can pour stuff in and how much it leaks out and what are better or worse methods of pouring stuff into people's head. And so that's where you get these sort of two general ideas of instructionism, the idea that what really good instruction looks like is experts explaining things and guiding novices in their learning, and some form of constructivism, social constructivism, this idea that people need to generate their own experiences. I think there's lots of room for both of these things in teaching and learning. There are lots of times and moments where the ways that people learn best is when you explain things to them, and when you show them what matters, and when you help them work through processes. It's also, it seems to be the case in lots of people's educational experiences, that when people try to do that with students who just don't care about something or don't feel connected to it, that it doesn't work very well. And that's an area in which more constructivist approaches that sort of have more attention to student agency and student autonomy seem to work pretty well. It also is the case, the sort of funny paradox is that in a lot of cases, sort of more direct instruction approaches work well for novices, but we don't want novices who can just sort of repeat and do the operations that they're shown how to do. We want them to then be able to flexibly deploy those skills, which is what more sort of constructivist learning ends up looking like. Some of the learning science argument is like, yes, but a thing to be careful of is that even though what we want at the end is for people to look like those flexible deployers of competency, that's not necessarily like the best way to learn how to do that is not necessarily through like a lot of experiences of open-ended problem solving. Actually, like more direct instruction can be what helps people do that. Now, our technologies sort of map onto these ideas. Most education technologies are overwhelmingly instructionist in nature. The vast majority of them are basically trying to say like, how can we have computers that tell things to people and then give them small tasks and check their answers around them. But there are some tools that sort of come out of this constructionist tradition, things like the Scratch programming language is very much organized around the idea of how do we inspire students to explore programming in an environment with like a very low floor to entry, and let them explore and pursue their interests, and those kinds of things. The sort of funny thing about schools is that schools also tend to overwhelmingly be organized around instructionist principles for various reasons, including organizational ones. And so sometimes like you'll see sort of kind of progressive constructionist tools like Scratch be brought into school systems, and then people find ways to use them like very contrary to the designer's original intent. So anyway, that's a riff on both of those ideas.
Right. That's incredible. I know that you talk about the peer guided learning environments, and I love the way you say that they defy easy summarization. And I'll tell you right now that that's something that I've struggled with forever. And I actually wrote here in my notes, please help me with my elevator speech. How do you define that, and how do you kind of share what the value is of peer guided learning environments?
Sure. So in the first half of the book, one of the things that I try to tell people, the first part of this conversation, we said, like there's a lot of history to education technology. There's actually not much that's new. When people come to you and say, we're here to sell you this brand new thing in education technology, your first inclination should be, your thing is not brand new. Your thing is a slight modification of something we already have because we've been doing this for 60 or 70 years. To help you sort of categorize technologies, I offer the idea that there are like three big genres of large scale learning technologies. There's instructor guided learning at scale. These are things like massive open online courses. They're any kind of learning experience where an instructor said, here's a sequence of learning experiences, and then a participant goes and follows them. There's algorithm guided learning at scale, these cognitive tutors that we were talking about, where a computer serves you up a learning experience and then tests you, and then an algorithm gives you a harder one or easy one based on your answer. And then there's peer guided learning at scale. And what peer guided technologies are is they say, actually, the sequence of learning experiences are not going to be defined by an instructor or by an algorithm, but they're going to be defined by the other members of the community. So the sort of optimal way to learn how to do Scratch is to like just start exploring in the Scratch community and finding other people who have done tutorials or finding projects that are interesting you want to copy, kind of moving through those sorts of networks. But actually, I mean, an interesting thing is that people are extremely proficient, in some respects, shockingly proficient at navigating these informal peer-based learning networks when it's something they're interested in. So I bet almost everyone watching this can think of some topic that they get really excited about learning, how to do their hair in a new way, how to do their makeup in a new way, how to play an instrument, how to code, how to beat a level in a video game. There are all kinds of folks, including young people, who have really successful learning experiences informally in these peer-guided learning environments. They tend to work much less well when we use them to try to teach students things that we think they ought to learn. So when folks with sort of low intrinsic motivation to learn a topic encounter these experiences, they're like, this is kind of confusing. I don't know exactly what I'm supposed to do here. I'm not that interested in following this peer network, and no one's really telling me what to do or making me do anything. So I'm just going to quit or go do something else or something like that. So they tend to be really, so they tend to work better in informal environments than in formal environments. Formal school systems have all kinds of norms and operations that make them not so great at supporting peer learning, including the fact that we have a huge emphasis on evaluating students as individuals as opposed to in groups. But you sort of have to, one of these paradoxes is like when people leave our school systems, they're all going to participate in these informal peer-guided learning experiences. There's some jobs and careers that you cannot do if you're not good at navigating these things. Like if you're not good at navigating, communities like Stack Overflow, which give help and support to learning in a program, you basically can't be a programmer. You sort of have to be able to do that. So a challenge of school systems is, very few school systems are going to deeply integrate peer-guided learning technologies into everything they do, because they're interest rate driven and our schools are curriculum driven because they're peer driven and our schools are individual driven. But we still have to build school systems that the ideal school systems will graduate folks who are good at navigating these networks. That doesn't mean that that's what they do for 12 years, but it means at various points in their learning trajectories, they have some opportunities to practice this kind of learning with expert mentorship and guidance so that they're even better at doing it when they want to pursue these things on their own.
So I guess one of, right or wrong, I think one of the takeaways I get from the book is just that no one thing is gonna solve our problems.
No, our problems are very, very complex, and they're very granular.
Yeah, and so I mean, maybe just talk about that.
Sure. So education technologies are not sweeping. They're not transformative. It's like schools are a sea of differently shaped bolt heads. And each technology is like a particular ratchet. And so you build some new technology and you like twist down one of those bolts a little tighter. And then it's good for like one or two other bolts that are kind of similar. And then you've got to find other ratchets to do the other bolts. Our tools are very particular. The other challenge of our, there's a bunch of our systems are incredibly, I'll finish that. Our systems are very granular. If you tell a school, we want you to get better at formative assessment, and they're a K-12 school system, that looks different when you're formatively assessing how a first grader is learning to stand in line than it does with a sixth grader who's in the earth science unit on plate tectonics, that's in a 12th grade, AP Mandarin course or something like that. Just if you think about the kinds of things that happen every day in school systems, the diversity of activity over 180 days across that school system is just like unfathomably granular and complex. That's one reason why it's really hard to make things better. Our schools balance competing tensions and interests. We want schools to to teach people content, to help them be nice to each other, to be good citizens, to be patriotic, to criticize the government, sort of all these different things, all these different subjects. And so when you start trying to change thing in one area, it often screws up some delicate balance in some other kind of area. And so, that granularity, that complexity, what it means is when schools improve, it tends to be because they incrementally pursue improvement in particular domains over long periods of time. You can make schools better with technology, but it's not like, oh, we all bought iPads and now the teaching is better.
We're all better now.
We're all better now. It's that we've made a commitment over many years to try to find one more thing that we can be better at, to work together as a community, to find joy in working with each other and getting better at that thing. And then when we feel like we make some progress, we pick the next thing and we move on to work on that. And technology can be some of those things. It's never exclusively about technology, because every technology solution is a human capital problem. And every time you integrate technology into some kind of learning community, you now have to teach people new routines, new pedagogies, new structures, new assessments, all this other kind of stuff to make it work. I think particularly, this message is not that hard for educators to pick up on. I think a lot of educators are like, yep, no transformative, change in my school of the last few decades. When we get better, it's because we put our shoulder to the wheel and we work on it for a while. And then we just pick up one thing at a time. It's sort of harder for technologists who come from this world of Moore's law, where, transistors have doubled on chips every year for 40 years. And of course, it's possible to see transformative change. So a lot of what I try to do in Failure to Disrupt is to sort of celebrate a tinkerer's mindset, to celebrate the notion that we absolutely can make schools better. We absolutely can use technology to do that, but it's not going to look like sweeping change. It's going to look like, continuous improvement. I mean, or my colleague Ken Kadinger says, sweeping change is what 25 years of incremental improvement looks like from a distance. Things get better, but they get better in small temporal increments. Yeah.
Yep. So I just want to touch a little bit on this, and I know we're running out of time, and I've got 17 other questions, but I think it's important that we talk a little bit about the risk, right? So we enter into this vast place when we start putting our information, on the interwebs, and we don't really know where it's going or who's collecting it. And we're kind of shaky about the good we're doing by doing that, but we do suspect that there is good in it. And so we take the risk. But are there wiser ways to take the risk? I mean, are there things that we should be doing to protect ourselves while we engage in this new technology?
Yeah, I think that's an incredibly complicated question for which people have different answers. And I would say I'm not totally settled. It is not a good thing to have vast amounts of data stored about people. My colleague Bruce Scher calls that a toxic asset. Now, toxic things can be powerful. You can actually do really cool things. If you know a lot about people's learning activities, in theory, you can build systems that help them more. But there are definitely risks there. It's hard to actually calculate how acute those risks are for any individual. There aren't a lot of examples where school systems have inadvertently been hacked or released a bunch of data about their students and their students have been harmed. It is not a good thing for school systems to inculcate young people into a culture of constant surveillance. It's not, I was talking about this with some colleagues recently that, one of the things that we do in schools is we watch each other. Watching each other is actually a really important part of teaching and learning. That watching, one of the things we've learned over the last 2 years is that watching is actually harder to do in certain kinds of ways in public. There's certain parts of teaching that are harder when parents are sort of constantly glancing over the shoulder to see what you're doing. But also, schools are public institutions, and so there should also be some amount of external watching and accountability and things like that. So I don't, there are lots of folks that have other some folks have answers that are things like, if you don't have the resources to have a staff that's like very closely vetting all of the terms of service, all the technology contracts that for every tool that any teacher in your system is using, then you need to sort of centralize all those functions and really think about better contracting, better privacy protection. I think there's a lot of that I'm sympathetic to. I'm also sympathetic to the fact that there are a lot of educators who just sort of grab the stuff that's out there and start doing pretty cool things with it. And the way that we figure out what kinds of tools that we want our students to do and new routines and new practices is through that kind of experimentation. I think it sort of cuts to the core of what schools do is they invite us to ask, like, what kinds of kids do we want to raise? What kind of communities do we want to be? And since this is an area of such substantial change, to me, it's hard to answer that super definitively. But I think if there are systems where students and teachers and administrators like find ways of regularly asking these questions, having these questions in dialogue with parents, I will say, having worked with lots of schools for a lot of years, I often find that the parents that have the most concern about these kinds of issues are those who work for technology companies. The people who know the most about what's going on inside these systems are like, really, we probably ought to be, raise our concern and care about how we protect people's their privacy and data and things like that. If there are places in school where we use digital tools to watch students and what they're doing all the time, we should talk to them about that, and they should have some understanding of that. There should also probably be places where teachers and learners are working and they're not being watched and surveilled that intensely and closely. And we say to them, like, don't worry, because there are definitely parts of the school in which you're free to engage in these learning activities in a way that's not being surveilled.
Yeah. It's funny, like when we talk about educational technology, we're talking about like from PowerSchool to Minecraft, and both of those things have they have something to offer. They have something to offer. I must confess that I know very little about Minecraft, and I probably should know more, because I'll guarantee that a lot of my students, certainly the students that I had in my previous environment, were very tuned in to Minecraft, and I don't know what they're getting from that. I don't know. Maybe you can tell me just a little bit about what is it that they're getting from Minecraft.
Yeah, those are also hard, controversial, and fraught questions. There would be to play online games. You have to learn a lot about, they are incredibly complex systems, and kids do an amazing job acquiring vast amounts of information about these complex systems. Lots of the challenges that they face in the rest of their lives will be similar complex systems for which they'll have to ask friends, watch videos, go online and find new resources, try things through trial and error, get expert mentor help. A huge question in the social sciences, though, in educational sciences, whether or not that kind of learning actually transfers from one complex system to another. So it's possible that if you get really good at doing that in Minecraft, what it means is that you'll be really good at playing Minecraft. And unfortunately, the next complex system that you encounter, like when you try to become a pharmaceutical executive or something like that, while it may have certain kinds of structural features that are similar to the complex systems of Minecraft, like the actual details are so different that it doesn't really matter.
And you're probably not going to be saying like, oh, in a conversation with another pharmaceutical person, this reminds me of Minecraft, right? Yeah, that's probably not going to go so far.
Well, although
maybe.
There are very similar problem-solving strategies across really different complex domains. You ask people for help, you try things in systematic ways. You take an iterative approach. You find you're resilient to risk. You sort of think about how you shape your identity in this space. I mean, there's all kinds of really extraordinary learning that people do when playing games. A huge open question is how much that extraordinary learning sort of translates to other kinds of domains. I mean, the other kind of learning is just around communication and collaboration and things like that, like especially when kids are playing Minecraft on servers with other kids and stuff like that. I mean, it's not that different from playground play. In some, they're making rules, they're testing boundaries, they're communicating with one another, they're setting and breaking and remaking hierarchies. They're doing all kinds of useful intellectual exercises. I think. But anyway, I mean, if I could kids spend 100 hours playing Minecraft or 100 hours like looking around at their data at Power School, I would definitely choose the Minecraft over Power School.
Yeah, and I definitely say it would be better than their parents looking, for 100 hours at their data on Power School.
Yeah,
that makes a lot of kids sick, I think.
Great. Well, we've come to the top of the hour, and it's been
Justin,
a really
I can't believe it.
conversation.
Thank you so much. Thank you all for everyone for tuning in. I hope you'll all go and buy Justin's book because it's worth the buy, Failure to Disrupt. Don't miss it. He's got a lot more to say. We just kind of skimmed the surface here, but it's worth a read. And if you have a professional learning community, it's worth a read with your colleagues because I think it starts conversations that are incredibly valuable. And maybe it will lead you, as I hope it leads me and our community here, to find the really good technologies that really help our students learn and help us to do our work in ways that reach beyond the classroom and into the community, because I think relationship is the key to all good things. So Justin, thank you so much. Have a wonderful night. I'm going to close, as we always do here at Slate School, by sending positive rice to everybody out there. Hope everybody's safe and well and having a good night. And I hope you'll all come and visit Slate School soon. Have a good night.
Thanks, Julie.
Thanks again, Justin.